The air in Normandy in July of 1944 tasted of rust and rot. We'd been pushing through this godforsaken bocage country for weeks, and every hedgerow was a wall hiding a German machine gun nest. The whole world had shrunk to the next 100 yards of mud and tangled green. My platoon, what was left of it, had learned the rhythm of this place. The whisper of a mortar shell before the crump, the metallic chatter of an MG-42, Hitler's buzzsaw, and the reassuring ping of an M1 Garand ejecting a clip. We were ghosts in a green maze, and the only thing that kept us alive was trusting the man next to you. That's why he was a problem. His name was Private Leo Schmidt. He was one of the replacements they'd shoved onto a transport plane a week after D-Day. Fresh-faced kids meant to fill the holes the Germans had torn in our ranks on Omaha Beach. When he reported to me, he looked like he'd gotten lost on his way to a library. He was skinny, with dark, restless eyes that darted everywhere, and his uniform hung off him like a sack. He was from New York City, he'd mumbled. One look at his soft hands and pale face, and I knew he'd never seen anything more dangerous than a pissed-off cab driver. The veterans took one look at him and nicknamed him Metro. Tex, a hulking farm boy from Amarillo who carried our bar, just shook his head. "Sarge," he drawled, "that boy ain't never seen a cow, let alone a kraut." I grunted. "And just keep him in the middle of the column. And for God's sake, don't let him touch the grenades." Metro's uselessness was a thing of beauty if you were into that kind of tragedy. During his first firefight, he didn't fire a single round. He just froze behind a dead milk cow, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle, his eyes wide with a terror so pure it was almost religious. I had to crawl over to him, screaming in his ear over the din of battle, just to get him to move. He looked at me, but I don't think he saw me. He was looking at the sound, at the sheer violence of it all. It was the look of a man already dead, just waiting for his body to catch up. I figured he'd wash out, get a $1 million wound, or just break completely. But he had a strange resilience, like a weed. He'd screw up, get screamed at, and then just retreat into himself, his fingers always fiddling with something. A loose thread on his jacket, a buckle, a piece of wire he'd found on the ground. It was that fiddling that got him into real trouble. A few days later, I caught him messing with the ignition wires of a lieutenant's Jeep. Not trying to steal it, he claimed. Just curious how it worked. The lieutenant wanted him court-martialed. I managed to talk him down, promising to assign the kid to latrine duty for a month. What the hell use was a car thief in the middle of a war? His skills were for the concrete jungle, for sneaking and stealing. Here in the mud, you needed to know how to dig a foxhole, clean a rifle blindfolded, and kill a man with a shovel if you had to. Metro couldn't even manage the first two. His foxholes were shallow graves, and his rifle was always a speck of dirt away from jamming. He was a walking liability, a ghost who was going to get real men killed. The old-timers knew it. We'd lost good men I'd trained with back in the States. Men like Corporal Evans, who could spot a German sniper's nest from 1,000 yards. Now I had Schmidt, who couldn't spot his own feet without tripping over them. It felt like a personal insult from whatever pencil pusher in command was reading the casualty reports. "Sergeant Miller needs a man," he probably said. "Send him the city boy who plays with wires." I sometimes imagined what General Patton would do with a kid like Metro. Old Blood and Guts would probably use him for target practice. Our breaking point came during a patrol near St. Lo. We were moving along a sunken lane, the hedgerows so thick they blotted out the sun. The silence was heavy, thick with unspoken fear. Every man knew this was perfect ambush country. We'd heard stories from other outfits, stories that sounded like something Rommel himself would have cooked up. And in that silence, Metro, who was supposed to be watching our flank, stumbled. He didn't just trip. He fell with a clatter of gear that sounded like a damn factory collapsing. A single flare hissed into the sky, a sickly green eye opening right above us. Then all hell broke loose. The buzzsaw of an MG-42 opened up from the hedgerow opposite, chewing up the dirt and trees around us. Men screamed, diving for cover. We were pinned, completely exposed. It took us 10 minutes of desperate, frantic fighting to suppress that gun and pull back, dragging 2 wounded men with us. Back at our makeshift command post, I grabbed Metro by the collar and slammed him against the stone wall of a ruined farmhouse. His helmet fell off, clattering on the ground. He was shaking, his face as white as a sheet. Yeah, you almost killed us all, I hissed, my voice low and shaking with rage. You hear me? All of us. For what? Because you can't watch where you're putting your goddamn feet? He just stared, tears welling in his eyes. I I saw something, Sarge. A wire on the ground. I tried to. A wire? I laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You saw a wire. You know what I see? I see a coward who's going to get my entire platoon wiped out. You are a burden, Schmidt. An anchor dragging us all down to hell. I let him go, and he slid down the wall. I walked away, my mind made up. I couldn't shoot him, and I couldn't send him back. But I could make him useful in a way. I could make him disappear. The next morning, I got my chance. Our advance was stalled by a narrow, stone-arched bridge. A Sherman from another company had tried to cross it and had been knocked out by an anti-tank gun. It now sat there half on the bridge, half off, completely blocking the way. Worse, it was a magnet for German mortar fire. Anything that got within 50 yards of it drew a rain of shells. The orders from the lieutenant were to bypass it. A long, dangerous trek through an exposed field. But I had another idea. I called Metro over. Private, I said, my voice flat and devoid of any emotion. You see that tank? He nodded, his eyes fixed on the smoking steel carcass. The comms gear in that Sherman might still be good. Lieutenant wants it salvaged. You're going to go out there, get inside, and pull the radio. You bring it back here. Understand? He looked from the tank to my face, and for the first time, I saw something other than fear in his eyes. It was understanding. He knew exactly what this was. It wasn't a mission. It was a death sentence. The field was a killing ground. The tank was the bullseye. No one could get to it and back alive. Sarge, the mortars, he began, his voice barely a whisper. That's the mission, Private, I cut him off. You're a specialist, right? Good with wires and electronics? This is your chance to prove you're not completely useless. I tossed him a pair of wire cutters. Now get going. We're moving out in 10. He stood there for a moment, the wire cutters in his hand. The men watched, silent. They knew too. This was me, Sergeant Frank Top Miller, cutting off a piece of my own command because it was diseased. It was brutal, but it was necessary. It was war. Without another word, Leo Schmidt slung his rifle over his shoulder, clutched the cutters, and started out towards the field. He moved low and fast, a skinny silhouette against the gray morning sky. I didn't watch him go. I turned to the rest of the platoon. All right, listen up, I barked, the cold pragmatism of the decision washing over me. We're heading west through the fields. Tex, you're on point. Let's move! As we filed out, heading away from the bridge, I allowed myself one last glance over my shoulder. Schmidt was halfway across the field, a tiny lone figure running towards the smoking wreck. Then the first mortar shell screamed in, and he disappeared in a cloud of black earth and smoke. I felt nothing. One problem solved. Now I had to deal with the Germans. We moved west, into the green labyrinth. The memory of Schmidt's lone figure vanishing into smoke was a bitter taste in the back of my throat, but I washed it down with the cold water from my canteen. I had made a hard choice, the kind they don't teach you about in officer's school. I'd cut off a limb to save the body. The platoon was lighter, faster, safer. That's what I told myself. The remaining men were veterans. They knew the sounds, the smells, the ugly geometry of combat. We were a finely tuned machine again. The fields the lieutenant's map had marked as our bypass route were eerily quiet. Too quiet. A long, sloping pasture bordered by thick, ancient hedgerows on three sides. A perfect grazing field for cows. A perfect kill box for soldiers. My gut tightened. I'd seen this kind of setup before in the Kasserine Pass, fighting against Rommel's ghost. It had the smell of a carefully laid trap. And something's not right, I muttered to Sergeant Relly, my best bar gunner, now that Tex was gone from the point. Never is, Top, he answered, his eyes scanning the impassive green walls around us. We were halfway across the field when the world tore itself apart. It didn't start with a rifle shot, but with a hollow whoosh from the hedgerow to our right. I saw the smoke trail for a split second before the projectile hit. The explosion wasn't large, but it was brutally intimate. Private Jensen, who had taken point, simply ceased to exist in a red mist. The man behind him was thrown back like a rag doll, his body mangled. A Panzerfaust, a goddamn tank killer, and they'd used it on our infantry. It was a statement of contempt. Before the echo of the blast had even faded, the air filled with the sound I dreaded most, Not one MG-42, but three, opening up from different positions, creating an interlocking field of fire. Hitler's buzzsaw ripped through our column, cutting men down before they could even hit the dirt. The grass around us danced as if in a hailstorm of lead. We were caught, utterly and completely, in the open. "Cover! Get to the ditch!" I roared, my voice raw. We scrambled for a shallow irrigation ditch that offered the barest protection, dragging the wounded with us. But the Germans had ranged it perfectly. Their machine guns were grazing the top of the ditch, forcing us to press our faces into the mud. We were pinned like insects on a board. The next hour was a blur of methodical German slaughter. They weren't wasting ammunition, they had us. They knew it. They'd let us bleed. Doc, our medic, crawled from man to man, his hands slick with blood, his bag of medical supplies shrinking with terrifying speed. "I can't stop the bleeding, Sarge," he yelled over the din as he worked on a kid whose leg was shredded. "I need to get him out." But there was no out. To raise your head was to lose it. We returned fire when we could, but it was futile. We were shooting at flashes hidden deep in the foliage. They were shooting at bodies trapped in a ditch. My mind raced, trying to find an angle, a weakness, anything. But there was nothing. It was a perfect trap. My decision to get rid of Schmidt, to take this route, had led my men here, to this muddy grave. Out here, we weren't soldiers in Eisenhower's Great Crusade. We were just names on a list, bleeding out in a field in France while the generals moved flags on a map. We were dying, slowly, one by one. Ammunition was running low. The groans of the wounded were becoming weaker. Despair began to set in, a cold, heavy blanket smothering the will to fight. We were just waiting for the final German assault. And then something strange happened. The MG-42 on our left flank, the one that had been methodically stitching a line of death just inches above our heads, went silent. Not a jam, not a reload. It just stopped. Dead. For a full minute, nothing happened. The other two guns kept firing, but the pressure was lessened. We could move a little, shift the wounded. "What was that?" Sergeant Trelli whispered, peering over the edge of the ditch. "Did you see anything?" "Nothing," I grunted. Keep your head down." A few minutes later, the real confusion began. We heard shouting from the German lines, angry, panicked yells in German. It wasn't the confident bark of orders, it was the sound of alarm. The rate of fire from the other machine guns slackened, became erratic. They were distracted. Then an American grenade, one of our pineapples, exploded with a dull whump from deep within the German positions on our right. It couldn't have been one of ours. The throw was impossible. My men looked at me, their faces a mixture of hope and utter confusion. "Sarge, who the hell is that?" I had no answer. My heart was pounding. It felt like the hand of God had reached down into our little patch of hell. The Germans were now firing wildly into the hedgerows behind them. They were fighting on two fronts. They were fighting a ghost. The chaos in their lines grew. We heard screams, the distinct crack of a single M1 Garand firing deliberately, methodically. Ping, a pause, then another shot. Whoever it was, he was deep inside their nest, and he was taking them apart. Just when I thought things couldn't get any stranger, a new sound began, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the cough and sputter of a heavy engine turning over, followed by the deep, guttural roar of a Maybach motor coming to life. It was a sound we all knew, a sound that haunted our nightmares. "Panther," Sergeant Trelli breathed, his face pale. "They had a tank in reserve. It's over." This was it. The final nail in our coffin. The tank had probably been hidden in a barn or under camouflage, waiting for us to be sufficiently weakened before moving in to finish the job. The ground began to tremble as its tracks bit into the earth. The roar grew louder, closer. We huddled in the ditch, helpless, waiting for the end. I gripped my rifle, a useless stick against 60 tons of German steel. The Panther burst through the main hedgerow in front of us with a deafening crash of splintering wood and tearing earth. It was a monster, its long 75mm cannon pointing towards the sky like a finger of judgment. The German infantry, still able to fight, began to rally near it, ready for the final push. But it didn't advance on us. It stopped. For a long, terrifying moment, it just sat there, its engine rumbling. A behemoth of steel dominating the battlefield. The Germans were yelling, gesturing towards us. But the tank's turret, instead of traversing towards our ditch, began to turn slowly, deliberately, in the opposite direction. It swung around past the German soldiers, who started to look confused. It kept turning until its cannon was pointing directly at the primary MG-42 nest on the far right. My men and I could only stare, our mouths agape. The Germans were screaming at the tank now, some running towards it, pounding on its hull. They didn't understand. We didn't understand. Then, with a deafening blast that shook the very air we breathed, the Panther's main gun fired. It didn't fire at us. It fired directly into the German machine gun position, obliterating it in a massive explosion of dirt, steel, and fire. The tank was not their trump card. It was their executioner. And we had no idea who was inside. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The world was a frozen picture. A monstrous German tank sitting in a field of American dead, its gun still smoking, and my surviving men huddled in a ditch, staring in disbelief. The Germans, their perfect ambush shattered by their own machine, were scrambling in pure panic. Their discipline was gone, replaced by a primal need to escape the roaring beast that had turned on them. That single moment of stunned silence was all I needed. The ghost in that machine had given us a chance, and by God, we were going to take it. "Fire!" I screamed, the word tearing from my throat. "Pour it on 'em!" It was as if a spell had been broken. Every man who could still hold a rifle rose from the ditch and opened fire. The sound of our M1s, so pitiful and weak just moments before, now sounded like a symphony of vengeance. The Panther's coaxial machine gun answered, a torrent of German lead now firing in support of us, tearing into the fleeing infantry. The hunter had become the hunted. The tank's turret began to turn again, its electric motors whining. It swung towards the last known MG-42 position, the one that had been suppressing us from the far side of the field. Before it could fire its main cannon, the nest went quiet. The crew, seeing their fate written in the smoking ruin of their comrades, had abandoned their weapon and fled. The battle, which had been a slow, grinding execution for over an hour, was over in less than 2 minutes. The surviving Germans melted back into the hedgerows they had come from, leaving their dead and their prize tank behind. The sudden silence that fell was heavier and more profound than the noise it replaced. It was the silence of a butcher's shop after the work is done, broken only by the low rumble of the Panther's engine and the quiet moans of our wounded. The tank sat motionless in the center of the field, its engine idling like a sleeping giant. The immediate threat was gone, but a new, terrifying question hung in the air. Who was the ghost? Was it a rogue German? A captured ally forced to fight? Or something else entirely? "Hold your fire," ordered my voice hoarse. "Sergeant Relly, with me. The rest of you, cover us." My heart hammered against my ribs as we advanced across the field, rifles raised. We moved slowly, cautiously, circling the great steel beast. Its hull was scarred and pitted, but it was operational. It was a war-winning weapon, and it was in the hands of a complete unknown. We were flies buzzing around a spider, unsure if we were already caught in its web. As we got closer, we could hear a clanging from inside. Then, the metallic screech of a latch being forced. With a groan, the commander's hatch on the top of the turret pushed open an inch, then stopped. A moment later, it was shoved open fully, and a figure began to climb out. He was covered in grease, his face a black mask of oil and sweat. He wore a German tanker's headset, which he fumbled to pull off his head. For a second, he was just a silhouette against the gray sky, a stranger born from the belly of our enemy. I tightened my grip on my rifle, my finger on the trigger. Then he turned, and the afternoon sun caught his face. He wiped a grimy hand across his cheek, leaving a pale streak of skin. My rifle sagged in my hands. Sergeant Trelli let out a long, low whistle that was half curse, half prayer. It was Private Leo Schmidt. He looked dazed, exhausted, and about 10 years older than he had that morning. He slid down the side of the tank's turret, his legs giving way as he hit the ground. He landed in a heap, breathing in deep, ragged gasps. The rest of my men, seeing him, slowly emerged from the ditch and walked towards the tank, their weapons lowered, their faces masks of utter shock. We formed a silent circle around him as he sat on the ground, leaning against the massive machine. "Schmidt," I finally managed to say, my voice barely a croak. "What? How?" He looked up at me. his dark, restless eyes finally still. He swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. "The mortars, Sarge," he began, his voice raspy. I dove into an old shell crater just as the first one hit. It saved me." He took another breath. "I did what you said. I went for the Sherman." He explained how he'd crawled the rest of the way to the disabled American tank. When he got inside, he saw that its radio was smashed beyond repair. But from its vantage point, he could see the whole field, the whole trap. He saw the machine gun nests dug into the hedgerows, and he saw the Panther hidden under a massive camouflage net in a pile of branches not 50 yards away. Its crew wasn't inside. They were with the other infantry lying in the grass, waiting for the slaughter to begin, eager for a front row seat. "They left the hatch open," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "They were so sure of themselves. They just left it open." He had crept out of the Sherman, crawled through a ditch, and slipped inside the Panther while the Germans were completely focused on us. The inside was a maze of wires and levers. But to him, it wasn't complicated. "It's just an engine, Sarge," he said, looking at his own filthy hands. "My cousin and I, back in Brooklyn, we used to borrow cars for joyrides. You learn how the wires work. The starter, the magneto, it's all the same, really. This one was just bigger, louder. It took me a minute to bypass the starter, but I got it." He looked around at the faces of the men he had just saved, the same men who had mocked him and watched him be sent to his death. There was no pride in his expression, only a deep, profound exhaustion. "I heard the MG-42s, he whispered. "I knew I had to do something." No one spoke. There was nothing to say. We just stood there, in the quiet aftermath, the scale of what he had done slowly sinking in. This kid, this useless city boy I'd written off as a coward and a thief, had used the skills from a delinquent past to save a platoon of hardened soldiers. He hadn't just faced his fear, he had hijacked it, hotwired it, and turned it into a 60-ton weapon. I walked over to him. He flinched slightly as I stood over him, as if expecting another blow, another rebuke. I didn't say thank you. I didn't say I was wrong. The words would be useless, hollow. Instead, I pulled out my canteen, the one I reserved for myself, and handed it to him. He looked up at me, his restless city eyes finally still. He takes it and drinks. I then pull out a crumpled pack of Lucky Strikes, shake one out, and hand it to him. I light it with my Zippo. That's it. That's all that needs to be said. I looked at this skinny kid from the city, a kid I'd sent to die, now the owner of a 60-ton German monster. I was the veteran, the hardened sergeant who knew everything about war. But today, the city boy who'd never seen a cow taught me the most important lesson. That sometimes the thing you think is a weakness is the very thing that will save you all. The war was far from over. But in that moment, in that bloody field in France, Private Leo Schmidt was no longer a burden. He was one of us. The silence that followed the battle was a heavy, suffocating thing. It was filled with the low groans of the wounded, the distant, angry buzz of a lone reconnaissance plane, and the ticking sound of the Panther's massive engine cooling down. The adrenaline had evaporated, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the stench of cordite and blood. We were no longer fighting for our lives. We were now custodians of a miracle, and none of us knew what to do with it. My men moved with the slow, deliberate motions of the exhausted. We collected the dog tags from our dead, laying them side by side near the ditch that had saved us. Doc, having done all he could for the seriously wounded, was now patching up the walking wounded with grim efficiency. And in the middle of it all sat the Panther, a 60-ton ghost from another world. It was both our salvation and our biggest problem. I found Schmidt still sitting by the tank, his back against its steel hull. He hadn't moved. The cigarette I'd given him had burned down to the filter, forgotten between his fingers. He was just staring out across the field, his eyes vacant. The hero of the hour looked like a lost child. The city kid had won the fight, but now he was stranded in the quiet, green hell that came after. And he was completely out of his depth. I knew that look. I'd seen it on the faces of men after their first real taste of combat, the 1,000-yard stare that looks right through you. He wasn't seeing the hedgerows of France. He was seeing the chaos inside that tank, reliving every deafening blast of the main gun, every rattle of the machine gun. He had stolen a car and ended up driving a mobile tomb, killing men he never saw. I knelt beside him and took the burnt-out cigarette from his fingers. "You with me, Schmidt?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He blinked, his focus slowly returning to the present. "Sarge," he whispered. The noise?" "I know, kid," I said. "Just breathe. It's over for now." It wasn't, of course. It was just the beginning of a new kind of trouble. That trouble arrived an hour later in the form of Lieutenant Davies. He was a fresh-faced officer, a 90-day wonder straight out of a textbook, who always looked like his uniform was a size too big and a shade too clean. He arrived with a small patrol, having heard the firefight from a mile away. He took in the scene, our dead, our wounded, the smoking German positions, and the colossal German tank sitting in the middle of the field, and his eyes went wide with a mixture of horror and naked ambition. "Sergeant Miller," he called out, striding towards me. "Report! What in God's name happened here?" I gave him the short, clinical version. "We were ambushed, sir, pinned down in a kill zone. The enemy had a Panther tank in reserve." Davies stared at the tank, his jaw slack. "A Panther? My God. How did you manage to knock it out? Where's the anti-tank team? Did you get them with a bazooka?" He was already writing the after-action report in his head, a report that would make him look very good. "We didn't knock it out, Lieutenant," I said, my voice flat. I gestured with my thumb towards Schmidt. "He did." The lieutenant looked at Schmidt, then back at me, a frown creasing his smooth forehead. "Private Schmidt? The kid from the motor pool you had on report last week? What are you talking about, Sergeant?" "He captured it, sir," I said, making sure my voice was loud enough for my men to hear. "He got inside and turned it on them. Saved the entire platoon." Davies stared at me as if I'd lost my mind. The idea was too absurd, too far outside the realm of what the Army considered possible. A private doesn't just capture a Panther tank. It doesn't happen. But the evidence was sitting right there, rumbling softly as its metal cooled. His ambition warred with his disbelief, and ambition won. "Incredible," he finally breathed, a greedy light shining in his eyes. This changes things. A captured Panther, fully operational. Do you know what a prize this is for Army intelligence? Sergeant, secure the tank. I'm radioing this in. Command will want this thing brought back to the rear immediately." He turned and strode toward his radio man, already barking orders. I saw the way he looked at the tank, like a prospector who had just struck gold. It wasn't our victory anymore. It was his discovery. Sergeant Trelli came up beside me, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the grass. "Well, that didn't take long," he muttered. "He'll be a captain by tomorrow. Probably tell him he took it himself with a damn pistol." I knew he was right. I had seen it 100 times. The men who bled and died in the mud were footnotes in the reports, written by the men in the clean uniforms. But this time was different. This victory belonged to the skinny kid who was still trying to stop his hands from shaking. I walked over to the tank and clapped a hand on Schmidt's shoulder. "Get on your feet, Private," I ordered. He looked up, confused. "Get inside, man," I said, pointing at the open hatch. "And don't let anyone but me or one of our guys in. You understand? This is your tank. You're driving it home." A flicker of something, not courage, but ownership, appeared in his eyes. He nodded, and with a new sense of purpose, he pulled himself up and disappeared back into the belly of the beast. When Lieutenant Davies returned, puffed up with self-importance, he found me and my surviving men forming a loose perimeter around the Panther. "All right, Miller," he said. "HQ is ecstatic. They're sending a recovery team, but they want us to try and move it off this field. Have the private get out of there. My man Corporal Albright has some experience with tractors. He can probably figure it out." I didn't move. "With all due respect, sir," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Corporal Albright isn't touching this tank. There's only one man here who knows how to operate it, and that's Private Schmidt. He's the one who captured it, and he'll be the one who drives it." Davies' face flushed with anger. A sergeant didn't question a direct order. "Your job is to follow orders, Sergeant. My order is to get your man out of that tank." I took a step closer, lowering my voice so only he could hear. "Sir, my men just got torn to shreds in this field. The only reason any of us are alive is because of that private in that tank. Right now, my only job is to keep my remaining men safe. And that tank is the best cover we have. We're not giving it up. We will move it when we are ready, and Schmidt will drive it. That is how it is going to be." We stared at each other for a long moment. He was an officer. I was an NCO. He could have me arrested on the spot, but he also saw the look in my eyes, and in the eyes of the grim, exhausted men standing behind me. We had just survived a massacre. We weren't in the mood to be pushed around. Finally, he backed down, his anger turning into a petulant scowl. "Fine," he snapped. "Have it your way, Sergeant. But any damage that comes to this asset is on your head." He turned and stalked off. The battle with the Germans was over. The battle for the trophy had just begun. I looked up at the steel turret. We had a prize, all right? A prize that painted a giant target on our backs, and our only hope of getting it home was a terrified kid from Brooklyn who knew how to hotwire a Buick. There's no manual for driving a captured 60-ton German behemoth through enemy territory. Our new mission was simple and insane: get the Panther back to the rear lines. Lieutenant Davies, after his little standoff with me, decided to tag along, ostensibly to supervise the asset, but really to make sure he was in every photo if we somehow succeeded. He and his radio man were a poison we had to swallow. The journey began with the resurrected roar of the Maybach engine. Schmidt was at the controls, his movements still hesitant but growing more confident. I made the decision to ride with him, crammed into the commander's position. I needed to be his eyes and ears, and frankly, I trusted no one else to do it. The rest of my men, the grim survivors of the ambush, formed a protective screen of infantry around us, walking alongside the steel monster that had saved them. We were the strangest parade in all of France, a handful of weary GIs, escorting a German predator home. Every meter was agony. The Panther was loud enough to announce our presence to every German for 5 miles. Every quiet farmhouse was a potential ambush site. Every tree line a hiding spot for a soldier with a Panzerfaust. My eyes burned from staring through the commander's periscope, scanning the bocage for threats. Inside the tank, the world was a claustrophobic hell of steel, sweat, and the smell of oil. I relayed instructions to Schmidt, trying to navigate the narrow, ancient farm roads that were never meant for a machine this size. "Easy on the left tread, kid," I'd yell over the engine's roar. "There's a ditch there that'll swallow us whole." "I see it, Sarge." His voice would crackle back, strained with focus. Lieutenant Davies, following in his Jeep a safe distance behind, kept squawking on the radio, demanding updates, asking if we were sure we were going the right way, his nervousness a constant, irritating buzz. We were about 3 miles from friendly lines, approaching a critical crossroads, when my gut went cold. The road ahead was too clear, too empty. "Stop," I ordered Schmidt. "Kill the engine." The sudden silence was deafening. I popped the hatch and listened. The sounds of the countryside washing over us. And I heard it. The faint, almost imperceptible, metallic click of a weapon being armed. "Ambush!" I hissed down to Schmidt. "Now get ready to start her up on my signal." I radioed the men outside. "Sergeant Trelli, report." "Got a bad feeling, Top." His voice came back low and steady. "The woods on the right side of that crossroads. It's too dark in there. No birds. Nothing." The Germans hadn't sent a tank. They'd sent hunters, specialists, men armed with the tools to kill a Panther quietly and efficiently. They knew we had to pass this crossroads. "They're waiting for the tank to enter the intersection," I said, thinking aloud. "They'll hit it from the flanks with Panzerfausts." "What are we going to do, Sarge?" Schmidt asked, his voice tight with fear. For the first time, I looked at him not as a liability or a hero, but as a soldier. My soldier. "You're going to do exactly what I tell you," I said, "and we are all going to get through this." This time, it wasn't a desperate gamble. It was a plan. We weren't the victims in a trap anymore. We were the bait. I laid out the plan over the radio. Sergeant Trelli and 2 men would circle wide, coming in on the woods from the rear. The rest would lay down covering fire on the opposite side of the road to create a distraction. "What about us, Sarge?" Davies' panicked voice crackled on the command channel. "Stay where you are, Lieutenant," I replied, my voice leaving no room for argument. "And stay off this channel." We waited for 5 agonizing minutes. Then, Sergeant Trelli's signal came. A single, soft whistle. It was time. "Hit it, Leo," I said. The Panther's engine roared to life. Schmidt didn't hesitate. He slammed the tank into gear and we lurched forward, a massive steel target rolling into the kill zone. Immediately, the woods to our right erupted in fire. A Panzerfaust streaked towards us, hitting the thick frontal armor with a deafening clang that rocked the entire tank, but failed to penetrate. They had shown their hand. "Machine gun! Right flank! Traverse!" I yelled. Schmidt acted on instinct. The coaxial MG-42 spitting fire, chewing up the foliage, where the anti-tank team was hiding. At the same moment, Sergeant Trelli and his men opened up on them from behind. Caught in a perfect crossfire, the German hunters were thrown into chaos. Another Panzerfaust fired wildly, sailing over our heads. It was over in 30 seconds. We rolled through the crossroads without stopping. Looking back, I saw Lieutenant Davies's jeep emerging from cover, him staring at the scene with a pale, shocked face. He hadn't fired a shot. He had frozen. An hour later, we saw it. An American flag flying over a hastily erected command post. We had made it. As we rumbled into the American lines, men stopped and stared, their jaws hanging open. Jeeps swerved to get out of our way. The impossible had arrived. When the Panther finally came to a stop, its engine sputtering into silence for the last time, a crowd gathered. Engineers, mechanics, and high-ranking officers swarmed the tank, touching it as if it were a religious artifact. They pulled Schmidt from the driver's hatch, a skinny, grease-covered kid, and stared at him like he was a ghost. Lieutenant Davies was already there, talking excitedly to a colonel, gesturing, explaining, no doubt positioning himself at the center of the story. They would take it from here. The tank, the story, the glory. It all belonged to them now. It would be classified, studied, and eventually become a footnote in a dry intelligence report. But we knew the truth. I found my men gathered together, cleaning their rifles, a tight-knit circle of survivors. I walked over to Schmidt. He was just a private again, standing with his platoon, watching the commotion around his captured prize. "You did good, kid," I said. It was all that needed to be said. He just nodded, a small, tired smile on his face. "We did good, Sarge." I pulled out my pack of Luckies. There were only 2 left. I handed one to him and put the other in my own mouth. As I lit his cigarette, then mine, I looked at the men around me. We weren't the same platoon that had walked into that ambush. We were something more. We were the boys who had driven a Panther home. The war would go on, and there would be more battles, more losses. But standing there in the smoke of our shared cigarettes, we were, for a brief moment, invincible.